YouTube, Dawson Rider here. Welcome to my video that's going to be titled Reacting to Your Thoughts on Kamen Rider, I almost said Gav, Kamen Rider Gotchard, there we go, something with a G. I separated this from the usual series review just because I wanted to get that out in a timely manner. However, I think I like this formula better because it does allow me to get the series review out in a more timely manner and kind of spend more time on this and not worry about like, oh, I have to add this on to the end. So, first of all, I just want to thank everybody for participating in this, whether it was leaving your comments on the series review or the community post. Obviously, I'm not going to get to read them all. I picked around 5-ish from each one, a couple other bonus ones just because they're short ones that I wanted to touch on. But I did obviously read everybody's, and I just want to say I appreciate that. That's kind of been a fun aspect of my last few series reviews, is getting that engagement. It also reminded me of some points that I forgot to bring up in my series review. So, also, for the longer ones, because even though I have all the time in the world here, there's no time limit, there's no actual audience in front of me, I still get tongue-tied when I have to speak publicly, or not speak publicly, read publicly. It's like one of my faults of many. So when I get a super long one, that's what she said, I'm going to post it up on screen. I'm going to post them up on screen anyway, but I'll post it up on screen and I kind of paraphrase the main talking points of it, just to keep things streamlined, and it makes me seem slightly less unprofessional. This one was an interesting one, a more positive one. The Electric Skeptic. I personally liked it. Even for me, the acting was on and off, but they're supposed to be high school kids. I'm about to start my second year of post-secondary. I don't know what that is, to be honest with you. So, not super fresh, but I can tell you that they're genuinely people that are happy to be there, like Hochiro. That's really interesting. I think that that is dependent on where you go to high school. I honestly can't think of anyone from my high school that acted like a cartoon character with a catchphrase. I think that's probably different everywhere. There might be people like that in Japan. I'm sure there's some people that were excited to be there. I know every school will have people that are more into it, but not like that where they're like, gotcha! So I think that's interesting, and there's another comment that sort of brings up something similar. I just find that interesting because it reminds me of growing up, or even now, you watch high school movies and they have certain stereotypes and stuff, and my high school was nothing like that. My high school could have given a crap about their football team and all these other weird cliches oh, it's the captain of the football team. I didn't even, I don't know, ours just felt like a mini prison where we're just all serving our sentence together and just everyone's really mad. I don't know. That makes it sound really terrible, but you know what I mean. It wasn't cliche. Certainly didn't have anyone yelling gotcha in the hallways. They also bring up that it might be a series that's better binged, and I also think that kind of your mileage may vary depending on a series. I've definitely had Sentai and Rider series where I've stopped watching it weekly, and binging it improved my opinion, like Tokusatsu, even Ryu Soldier and stuff like that. Revice, I think that probably worked for, I guess, in Geats, but this one, obviously, because I wasn't doing regular coverage, there was times where I would be behind on a few episodes, and I think it's just because I was in the thick of it, but 3 to 4 episodes was torture for me, so that's not so much for me. But maybe if I'm in a different mindset, if I ever decide to rewatch it and I don't have any pressing coverage or anything like that, and I'm kind of just out of the hate fog, maybe that will help. But that is something that happens for people, and it's happened for me in other series. Now, this is one that brought up something that I forgot to mention in my series review from Lindsay TV Film. It felt like even the writers forgot they had to give Rin and Valverod's final forms. That also adds to how it feels like they dropped a lot with other plot points and the dad plot. I also thought in the penultimate episode they were going to reveal that Greon was Hochiro's dad, effectively. That's what he's saying. Again, I'm paraphrasing here. That's actually really interesting. I never really thought about that. I feel would he have recognized him? Would anybody recognize him? Does Hochiro know what his dad looks like? I don't know. But yeah, it definitely felt like there was too many plots going on and some were dropped. I mentioned in the review for sure about the dad thing. That was, again, weird to me. It's not unusual for them to have things that might be followed up on in a post-series story. But like I said in the review, because that was in episode 1, you assume it would be something that was addressed in the series. If it was something that was introduced in episode 40, I'd be okay, they're setting that up for later. And this comment in particular reminded me of how I forgot to mention how weird it is that Rin and Valverod's final form were so late in the series. Valverod's was, I think, the penultimate episode or the penultimate episode. It was nuts. When Rin got hers, I looked it up, and I think Keiwa's final form in Geats was episode 40. So you had those two writers getting it late in the series, but you still had 5+ episodes to sit with them. And they're going to get it later than the main writer. But yeah, that was insanely late. You had no time to sit with them. It just came across as rushed and crazy. This one is from JoeX1750. Gotchard for me is the definition of wasted potential. The story is all over the place. Majority of the characters are either bland, forgettable, or downright annoying. Hochiro, Spanner, and Greon being the worst characters. The show also suffers from constant Deus Machina ass pulls. Lachis, Kryoka, Kajiki, and Legend were the only enjoyable aspects of the show. Overall, Gotchard is the worst in the Ryu so far. So, yeah, I wanted to bring up this because it reminded me of something that I was annoyed that, especially in the finale, Hotaro was like, oh, I'll just solve it with my great alchemy skills, like, with the power of friendship. Like, he gets turned to gold and he's like, no, I'll defeat you and create a world with the power of friendship. I think I was just so done that I forgot to be annoyed at that. But that definitely happened a lot where it was like, Kenny's friendship! And that is a common Toku thing. I know it's a kid show. I still don't think kid show is like an excuse for like, you know, to be bad or anything like that, but it's fine to have concepts like that or kind of cheesy concepts. That's honestly fine. But it happened a lot in this series where it would just be like the power of friendship and chemis, and that definitely did annoy me in the finale. I think that I kind of just forgot to bring it up because I just was so, and at that point I just didn't care enough that it would upset me. Like in another series where I was really enjoying it and was really invested, then it would bother me more. Kind of like with Yeats, as much as I loved that, the fact that they were worshiping his like specialist boy point of view and his sort of god powers, god mode stuff fixed a lot of stuff, bothered me, not in the sense that it ruined the show, but it bothered me a little bit more there because I was invested. I think it was just because I wasn't invested, it just kind of added to the pile of things I was annoyed by. This one from someone who I see in the comments quite a lot, so thanks for sticking around for my nonsense, is Crudderbutter XD, Gale of Darkness. I added the Gale of Darkness. So again, this is one I'm going to paraphrase. So this first one he talks about it going back to basics, which was a nice change of pace. Kind of back to like the O's wizard times of like the beginning filler focusing on characters of the week. And it was a nice change of pace from sort of just trying to solve a big threat like Saber or Revice. I thought this was interesting just because I thought back on it, and I'm curious to get your guys' feedback for maybe somebody that's either watched or rewatched something from like the double wizard era, you know, double through wizard, the era where they tried to make Foundation X happen. That was still such wasted potential. That could have been such a cool long running story. Anyway, because that is true. You know, you have that formula that I think Deno kind of soft started a lot of things about the modern era. Kiva too, to a degree, but Double was really when we got this formula where we've been locked in on 90% of the time. And you have that first quarter that does focus on more filler of the week stories or the classic two-parter story. But from what I remember, and it's been a hot minute since I've fully rewatched these series like Double, O's, Wizard, when you did have that quote-unquote filler period, it still felt like there was more going on in the background. Like, that's one of the things I always talk about that I like about Rider over Sentai, or that at least I appreciate the difference, is it's more serialized, and even when you had that filler period, it felt like there was more building in the background, whereas I think with Gotchard, outside of the pilot and introducing stuff like Valvarad, it felt like very little was happening, and it was true filler, which didn't help like maintain my interest in the series. And I also have to say, this isn't an actually thing, but thinking about Revice definitely had that of the week format. Like, that first quarter was definitely like double O's coded, it felt, at least in my opinion, where you had the case of the week stories with like people and their demons, and I think they even sprinkled a couple of those later in the series. Talks about kind of the gimmick and how it was used and how the focus on the chemis let things fall by the wayside. And that part is interesting because it really did feel like that, but it still felt like the chemis were underdeveloped. Like, it felt like most of the attention was on the chemis, like you gotta save them and working with humans, but it felt so surface level. But also the point I wanted to bring up here is talking about, and I think a couple other people brought this up, about alchemy and how it was used, and kind of just almost used more like magic rather than true alchemy, and I think that's true. Normally that wouldn't necessarily bother me, but like the more I thought about it, there really was such wasted potential with that. Like, talking about those early episodes where we got the ability forms, there could have been some cool stories, and there have been writer shows like this in the past with the early forms where they're like, okay, I think 01 had this, unless I'm misremembering it, like, okay, we have this enemy that has this very specific problem, we need this new form to counter it. And I think with the alchemy element, that really could have been a major element to play, thank you, where you would maybe have like an enemy that's like, okay, this is very specific, I can't beat him with this, like, and maybe doing some experiments to figure out the right combination until you get the Hawk to form or the Samurai form and stuff like that. I think that would have been kind of cool. It could have been a way that they could have done that and showed their skills and trying to combine things rather than it just being like, oh, we got two chemis and they're friends, look, their little faces line up on the cards. This next section here has some really good points about the characters, like kind of echoing a lot of what I said about Hotaro. Like, his main problem is he's like the definition of a catchphrase character, and that kind of summarizes a lot what I say about it. Is I've talked about that in numerous reviews, how I'm not a fan of that catchphrase character, and he's kind of the worst about it. And the main point I wanted to bring up that I really like that he says is I did say in my review that I felt there was too many characters, and he brings up a good point that it's not necessarily too many characters, it's the utilization. And I think that's actually a better way of putting it, because I was thinking back to even something like Revice, where I stand by that I think that series did have too many characters, especially too many writer characters. However, I also had to commend them for the fact that everybody that got a writer spotlight did at least have a storyline. It didn't feel like they were just there compared to someone like Kajiki or Renge and Sabe Maru, whatever their names were. Like, it felt like if you cut them out, you wouldn't lose anything. So I do agree about the utilization. I think that if they had been more crucial to things, it would have felt better, but I think it's because they felt so useless that I felt that if you just cut them out, you could have time for all these other characters and other things that you're setting up. And Kajiki too, you know, I know some people brought up like, oh, he did serve this purpose of like Hotaro's anchor to the normal world. But for me, he was just so divorced from it because of how like few and far between his appearances were. It just made it feel awkward. Like, why are you even here? So I agree. I think that's a better way of putting it, that it's more about the utilization than the size of the cast. This is more of a quick short one that I'm just kind of curious about from Cody Blask 9207. Who says, like, to believe it or not, Japan actually loves Gotchard. I actually just wanted to bring that up because I've heard, like, both things. I've heard people saying, like, oh, it's a success, people love it there compared to us in the West or whatever. But I've also heard, like, the opposite. Like, not that it was doing terrible numbers, and to be fair, get after it then. I don't, like, closely follow the toy sales or the ratings. Every now and then I'll see someone bring it up, or if, like, there's some major story about it, I'll hear about it. But I don't follow that for any of the 3 shows. You know, a lot of people do. But anyway, point is, watch Letterkenny. That I've heard the opposite, where I heard that it wasn't doing as well as they thought, and like that's the reason for the retooling, like why they put Legend in there. Like obviously we did the Legend like webisodes, but why Legend came into the main show, thank you. And then why we had that retooling, like second era feel. Like we have had distinct arcs in Rider, especially recently, where you have this sort of season arc feeling thing where it's like, okay, we close this arc off and this is the second arc feeling like a season 2. But this felt like a retooling, like honestly, especially with the new intro. I mean, they didn't change the song, but like with the 3 writers and stuff like Legend and Future Hotaro, it felt very purposeful. So I think there's some truth to that, but I just wanted to add that because I've seen mixed things. I've seen people say like, oh, people love Gotchard, but then I've also seen people saying, no, it was kind of in trouble, so that's why they did the retooling where we had that like second era where Spanner and Rin became more prominent and we had Daybreak and Legend. An interesting one from Marveloso that says, I honestly think they should have gone the Pokemon route and have the show be about the characters effectively traveling around to collect the chemis like a slice of life thing. And I think that's kind of interesting. I feel that maybe it wouldn't have been for me, as it would have been even more episodic than what we got, but I definitely think an aspect of that could have made you care about the chemis more and would have been a different way to go about it. I think obviously you'd have to have some sort of conflict, but I think that something with that idea could have been a better way to show off the chemis and actually make you remember more of them than just the main ones and like Smartphone and Cactus and whatnot. This is a very well thought out long comment from the Arceus for the win. Another regular commenter, appreciate you. Again, I'm just going to paraphrase some of this and put it up on the screen, but some good points here about, I wanted to highlight like people's different experiences, because he talks about how he kind of has a soft spot for Gotchard because it was the first one he got to watch week to week, and I think that can happen definitely, and I've had series like that too, Otoku or otherwise, where you might acknowledge like it's not the greatest show, but like it was maybe your first series or your first time getting to watch it regularly. Like this isn't a series I have negative emotions towards, but like Go Onger, it's not like a favorite of mine, but I have a soft spot for it because it was like the first time I was regularly watching it after I got into Sentai. Like Geki Ranger was my first one, but then it was like the first time I was like in it. And so I have like this soft spot for that reason. Same thing with Hurricaneer. It was the first series that I was able to backlog watch, and I don't have any negative towards that at all. I like that show a lot, but I'm always gonna have a soft spot for it because of my experience with that. So just, he talks about how it was a show that kind of lifted him up in a dark time, and that's also, I think that's great. That's great for you, that's great for anybody that had that experience. You know, I've had shows like that too, where even just simply the routine of watching something can have you have a special place for it if it lifts you up. And I think that's just good to highlight that it's more than just, oh, the show is a mess and I hate Hotaro. So I think it's nice that people were able to have a positive experience with this show. Oh my god, hold on. I have to read this right. Trippin' since 86. I love Gotchard. It's definitely my favorite Ryo show, even when it's flaws. I relate a lot to the show's theme and the main character Hotaro, as the show and Hotaro helped me realize that I need to get back up time and time again and keep pushing towards my gotcha little by little and inspire others to do the same. I've always been grateful to it, as I can confidently say it changed my life. It will always hold a special place in my heart. So yeah, someone that was actually more positively affected by the message of Hotaro and the whole gotcha thing. And I think that's good. For people that actually took it away from that, I think that's kind of the point, especially for kids. I think that's the point. For me, it didn't land. I see what they were trying to do, but it felt very disingenuous because of how, just the performance. The performance was so and it didn't feel like a real person. But something I wanted to bring up or ask is, how does the gotcha thing work? I mean, like, I know what it is. It's kind of like your dream in life, but like, does that have some sort of dual meaning in Japan where that makes sense, where finding your gotcha makes sense as finding your purpose, or is that just like a weird quirk of the show? Because like, that is kind of weird. Like I found my gotcha. It's like, I don't, does that, maybe in Japan it makes sense, like there's some sort of pun or meaning where it means like a meaning of life, but I just always thought that was weird, like now that I think about it more. Another one from JJJ Madness 8306. Talks about how it suffers from the conflicting writers, which is something I forgot to bring up, which I guess there was multiple different writers, which results in kind of the mixed conflict of the series, which that makes a lot of sense once you learn about that. Also, the fact that the quest for the 101 chemis felt hollow, which something else I didn't bring up in the review, but yeah, like when we got to that where we have all of them, it felt like it was at the end of this big arc that we never really were that invested in. It just kind of ties back to them being able to do more with the chemis if they could have. So, brings up the thing I mentioned also in that other comment about alchemy feeling more like magic and could have been utilized better. How that kind of ties into the very basic example of like, oh, alchemy can be used to make gold, and that ties into how silly Grayon's motivation is. Something I wanted to highlight is this addresses something I talked about in my review when I was wondering about the experience of people that live in Japan that can watch the movies. Is a comment from, oh my god, there's so many letters, user VF9UW3YW7Q. I'm Japanese and I used to be a big Kamen Rider fan during the Heisei era. I always made it to the cinema for the first day of summer movies came out to make sure I wasn't missing out. Nowadays I watch the series but don't feel the urge to check out the movies. I think a lot of people feel the same since the box office hasn't been doing good. That's interesting. I'm glad I got someone's perspective on that. Almost sounds kind of like a lot of people's outlook on the MCU nowadays where they'll watch what they want to but be like, oh, I'll check out like the Marvels or whatever on Disney Plus, or I'll check out I don't know, She-Hulk later or whatever. Like I think that's kind of a similar attitude. But I wanted to highlight that. I appreciate you addressing that because I am legitimately curious about that, because our experience is often having to either look up the summary for a movie if we're missing something or want to know, or just having to wait till the next year. Now, this one I want to bring up because I mentioned Saber, which a lot of people mention Saber like, oh, at least it wasn't Saber and stuff. It just says, I totally agree the show was such a drag. It has the exact problem with Saber, with the main writer being too cliche and with the messaging. There's also too many subplots. There were more important subplots that didn't get answered. The villains were subpar and generic. The whole show was rather generic, and the fact that the last form of the series is just an upgrade of the base form, with a slight difference in the belt, but still the original form. However, at least Saber had the excuse of being made during the pandemic. So that's an interesting point. I just wanted to bring that up for two reasons. Number one, there is a lot of similarities between Hotaro and Saber. Dude, I'm forgetting the dude's name. Saber. But yeah, they both had that very specialist boy attitude. I think in a lot of ways, those two were like the peak of the specialist boy character type thing, which I hate. I definitely tolerated Saber more as a character outside of his outfits, but I didn't like either one of them. I think Hotaro's performance was worse, but there definitely was a similarity there. However, I just bring that up because I do have a soft spot for Saber, and I see a lot of people being like, at least it wasn't Saber. Like, in my opinion, Saber was a lot better. I think that even though early on I wasn't invested, there was more story going on. I think the mythology was more thought out. Personally, I did connect with the theme more about stories being important. That's a series where I absolutely understand the criticisms and the dislike for it, but I just brought that up because I think that it kind of shows me that there are people in the comments here that literally like Gotchard, and, it meant something to them, and they enjoyed it, and it's kind of the way I feel about Saber. And so it just kind of goes to show you that everyone's going to connect with some series. Some people are going to connect with some series and some won't, and I just thought that was interesting that there's kind of a parallel there where I just can't even imagine liking certain aspects of Gotchard where people like them, and I can see why. And then with Saber, it's like the same thing. It's like some people I'm sure can't even understand why I even like Saber, but a Saber comparison was brought up quite often, and I understand it, but yet I have a soft spot for Saber, and I kind of feel the same way too, where people are like, Gotchard gets way too much hate, and I'm like, Saber gets way too much hate. It's also another series where, even though I didn't hate the series at all, honestly, and I have a soft spot for it, where I don't really have too many favorite characters out of that series, kind of like this series. Like, there's characters I liked more, like Spanner and Kyoka, and like in Saber, it was basically like Espada and anybody that wore Caliber, and, I guess Buster was a good dad, but other than that, there wasn't a whole lot of main takeaways from that series. Alright, this last one I want to highlight in two ways. It's two different comments from Fire Fury 190. He has a very long, very well thought out comment about things. Just addressing some of this stuff from the first one, which is more about Gotchard, talking about the characters. Interesting how he's talking about how he thinks Hotaro was like the most changed and won him over. I'm glad you were able to, find a like for that character. But I think that's interesting because, at least in my opinion, I didn't feel like Hotaro changed all that much. Outside of just being more experienced as a writer, I felt like he was generally just the same, like, I'm gonna save you with the power of friendship and chemis! And I feel like he got his ass handed to him way often. I think Spanner felt like he got the most development. Rin definitely changed, but it felt more like just that cliche, like, oh, I'm really stern and whatever, but now I'm warmed up to you and all this stuff. So I thought that was kind of interesting, just because for me, Hotaro felt like he largely stayed the same, but it's interesting to see some different perspectives and read on things. It brings up some good stuff about kind of what I was talking about, the other comment about it would have been better if they could have focused on the chemis more as a concept without a main villain, kind of maybe springboarding off that idea of them traveling around and gathering them. He's the one that brought up more about Kajiki not feeling useless because he has a purpose, and like I said, I think that's a really good point. That made me kind of see what Kajiki's role was. I just think it could have been integrated more, just because, like I said, the frequency in which he showed up, it was like I forgot about him unless I wasn't looking at him. He was like the Silence of Kamen Rider characters, except a million times less cool. So I think that could have just been integrated more, and that kind of goes back to the other comment of, at the end of the day, actually maybe saying, it's not so much there's too many characters, it was just utilization. Now this other question is really interesting. It's kind of more of a question about my taste and asking why I get more annoyed or worn down by the formulaic aspects of Rider over Sentai. And I think that's interesting because it really made me think. Like, I think that's going to be different for everybody. And I really, in a lot of ways, can't give you one concrete reasoning. I think it just comes down to your experience and taste. And it makes me think about other franchises where I view things differently depending on the franchise. Like, I think that in general, when it comes to filler episodes, Toku is like my least favorite type of filler. Like, I have a much harder time, get much more easily annoyed at a Sentai or Toku filler, especially when it's a larger stretch of them. But like, I love a good supernatural filler episode, or this is kind of a bad example, but like Star Trek, because most Star Trek series have a lot more episodic episodes because it's more meant to be self-contained. But you know what I mean? It's like I appreciate more self-contained filler stories in Supernatural or Star Trek, or a good sitcom filler, because a lot of that's filler anyway. You know what I mean? The word filler being loosely defined. But the point is different taste for different things. It's kind of like I've been on kind of a Doctor Who kick lately, and I find that to be a very interesting franchise that I like differently than other ones, because it's this perfect midway point where I really care about the mythology and story and want to learn more, but it can be very inconsistent with a lot of plot holes and questions. And even though sometimes it'll frustrate me, with that series, for whatever reason, I can just let it go more and be like, it's Doctor Who. Like, but there's other series where I don't get mad like fans now. Like, I don't get like that. But like, there are other series like with Star Wars, it's like, I want to know more about this, or like, oh, this doesn't line up, are they going to fix this? And again, not in a way that fans are like acting like they're fighting for an important cause. But there's series where I definitely care more about certain things or enjoy things in a different way, where there's series where I'm like, okay, that doesn't line up, how are they going to fix that? And but with Doctor Who, it's like this weird mix of when I'm able to watch it, I can just let it go easier while simultaneously caring about the lore and story. I'm getting away from my point. But the point is I think that for whatever reason, I experience things differently depending on how I view them and how I enjoy them. And I think with Sentai and Rider, I think it maybe just has to do with like the way I got into it. Like with Sentai, obviously that was the first thing I watched before Rider, being grandfathered in from Power Rangers, so I was already used to the formula and going into it expecting the cliche formula of, fight the monster, blow it up, gets bigger, blow it up again. And with Rider, I think then it was a bit different, because when I first got into it, I started with Kiva, but then that whole stretch of like Kiva and before that, it wasn't as formulaic as it is now, and it was a little bit different. And I think that it's just because I was so used to it, already expecting it with Sentai. I think that plays a part in it. And I think the other two reasons come down to the fact that I think after Double, Rider really hit this stride where they really have this very distinct formula where you can really see all the points coming. Like, oh, this is the super form, and here comes this twist. Oh, it's time for the final form and stuff like that. Not to mention, I think that as Rider's gotten more popular and we got more forms and toys, I think that the toys become more intrusive. So you can always tell, like, oh, they have to debut this and that. And so you can see so much of it coming, and it just becomes so cliche. Not to mention, as I've mentioned in the past, I think so many of the main characters feel the same, so it makes it all feel more formulaic. And I feel like I've watched Rider become more formulaic, and they haven't been as experimental. And I think also a factor in that is, and also to be fair, I have been kind of on and off with Sentai. Like, I stopped watching Tokyuger for a bit, Go-Sager, Ryu Soldier, even Dawn Brothers for a little bit. So I have had some fatigue with that as well. But I think Sentai actually has been pretty experimental the last few years. We obviously highlight King Oger, Dawn Brothers, and Zenkaiger, but when you think about it, for this last stretch of time, they've been doing a lot of unique things with like Q-Ranger, Loopat, and even before Zenkaiger and stuff like that. So there have been some shakeups with the formula, whereas with that stretch of like you go from Q-Ranger to now, there's been a lot of formulaic Sentai, but there's also been a lot of different like flavors and different things that have shooken it up more than Rider. Like, I feel like Geats was the only series in the last while that's felt like it shook things up, and I think it's just because I've watched it become more formulaic. And like I said, the toy aspect also becomes more intrusive. It's obviously there in Sentai too, but they don't have as many. And I don't know. I think that's interesting to think about. But I think ultimately, I tried to think of some reasons for that. But I think ultimately it just comes down to, for whatever reason, I just have different experiences with different things that I enjoy. But anyways, guys, I want to thank you guys again for all those that participated. Again, I'm sorry I couldn't read everybody's, and I hope you're okay with me doing like the paraphrase thing. It just makes it a little more streamlined. But yeah, thanks again, and I will be doing this for future series reviews. But until next time, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and climb the steps and ring that bell to get notifications for my videos. Dawson Ryder, signing out.